story's book is an exemplary importance.
Is of exemplary importance.
Is of exemplary importance.
If you just get that part,
Woo!
clip it together.
It's a hard
This
sentence.
is the worst sentence so far.
Tongue twister.
Is of exemplary importance.
Do I need to start back over anywhere right there? Did you hear me miss anything?
No.
You mean Jay?
I know what you meant.
You ready, babe?
Every time.
Oh, that's not the first time.
I'll let you listen to it all before I upload.
Oh, I'm fine. As long as you can get what you need out of it, girl.
No comment about
You
it.
ready, bro?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right.
Carl Jung was a psychologist who did much to affect our modern attitude toward the mind. When his colleague Freud was still proclaiming that our amorous qualities were at the base of the majority of our thoughts and impulses, Jung countered from his own studies that there are also many mystical and spiritual areas of our unconscious seeking outlet. Great addition to knowledge as that was, perhaps his best accomplishment was to give form to and invent both a name and concept for the term we have come to know as synchronicity. Simply put, synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. A coincidence which, in fact, by its nature, is not really a coincidence. I know I've experienced it many times in my lifetime, and I'm sure you have as well.
Carl Jung lived in a time period from 1875 to 1961. This was a rapid time in development for psychology. Sigmund Freud was born 1856 and passed several years prior to Jung in 1939. Despite the 19-year age gap and the two radically different takes on psychoanalytic processes, the two were quite close for years, having met 1907 and not splitting off from one another until late 1913. For over a decade, the two were engrossed in debate and played off one another quite well. Freud was known to even say Jung was fit to be heir of his psychoanalytic theories. But while Freud perfected and inspired theories such as the Freudian slip and the 5 stages of psychosexual development, Jung focused on more mystical and spiritual aspects of human psychology and the way our universe sends us signals. At times, they are theorized to have deeper meaning. All this while developing the basis theories that inspired things such as Alcoholics Anonymous and the Myers-Briggs personality test. Simply stated, synchronicity is a non-casual event in the external world coincides with things going on in the internal world, such as our thoughts, feelings, and dreams. Jung was attempting to remove the superstition and fantasy which surrounded unpredictable and impressive events, and present as best as he could a scientific framework that would provide clarification and enable a discussion of such events. A kind of scientific method to the extraordinary. Events like these inspire those of us all over the world.
Some years ago, I was traveling in New England, looking for the treasures from years gone by that hide there in such rich profusion. I had stopped with my family for dishes of ice cream as a centering process. I will always remember what happened next in the context of French vanilla ice cream in a stainless steel bowl. A large antique mall nearby had been built in the 19th century train station. There were literally tens of thousands of items in the mall. I hardly knew where to start, but spied a group of books off to one side in an alcove. I decided to start there. I first picked up a volume of Emerson, and then an obscure book of essays by George William Curtis. Next, a lovely old first American edition of Adam Bede by George Eliot, Marianne Evans. This I studied. It had been rebacked with nice contemporary leather. I opened it to the half title. There had been some writing there. In the left-hand corner was the owner's signature, Abby Bliss, Amherst, 1862. Just below were these electrifying words, "To Abby, from Emily and Vinny, in handwriting like no other. I stared at the words as if in a trance. With trembling hands, I paid for the book and locked it in my car. An all-afternoon search failed to locate anything else similar, and yet it had been the third item I touched. Later that evening, I sat in wonder, holding the book and turning its pages to discover marking after marking of lines of interest to the original reader. I lived with the book for months, and in those months I felt I was coming to understand this long-dead poet in ways few modern times or any times have ever known. The lines that she marked were of interest to her for the creative ideas they sparked. Ideas which I believe culminated, at least in some instances, in immortal verse. Good example of things Emily noted were on page 382, chapter 45.
I met nobody, for it was very early, and I got into the wood.
Noting the personification of nobody. Emily owned the book for a couple of years before she gave it to Abby. In 1861, she wrote the famous,
I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too?
On page 131, she marked,
Nature has her language, and she is not unveracious.
Is this not Dickinson to a T? And yet George Eliot wrote it. To me now, George Eliot and Emily Dickinson are like spiritual sisters, in tune to one another from afar. I will never see them in any other way. Life is humbling in its largeness, and yet from this comes our greatest strength. That day many years ago, embedded in my brain as Ice Cream and Emily, was an example of synchronicity. Thinking back over it, another major factor was the fact that I knew how her handwriting looked. Think of the probabilities. No book like it had ever been found. I knew what it was. The actual chance of me happening along like that was 1,000,000 to 1. Think of when you thought of a dear friend hundreds of miles away. A few minutes go by and you receive a call or a letter. That's a synchronicity. Think of when you had a flat tire and missed an important appointment, but later found out you just barely missed driving into a tornado or massive oil spill or car accident, or perhaps discovered as you were changing the tire that your brake line was leaking. I suspect if you use your memory, you will find dozens of examples. And what does it show? I quote Walt Whitman a lot, but I can't help it. He always spoke so well.
Do you see, O my brothers and sisters? It is form, union, and plan.
That's what we find in it. The meanings hidden everywhere, but also revealed everywhere. As we use our eyes to see, as Henry Thoreau suggested, we need to strive to become more fully awake.
So what does this mean? To fully demonstrate the realness of this experience, you need to understand who these people are and what was found here. In his hands, he held a book inscribed by Emily Dickinson's real and true friend, Abby Wood Bliss. She is featured in an exhibit in the Emily Dickinson Museum. She lived 1830 to 1915. It also mentions Emily's sister, Vinny, who was exponentially important to Emily. Abby took part in what made up the close group of girlhood friends that the poet called our Circle of Five from her youthful days in Amherst Academy. They were close and wrote to each other in books often, a good well-known example of this being the penciled-in notes in their shared 1838 copy of the works of Virgil, which shows the two trying to endure their academics with humor. Emily even writes,
Abby and I are plotting over our books pretty much as ever.
That copy of the works of Virgil is now housed at the Amherst College Library in Massachusetts. And it's a distinct example that shows this story's book is of exemplary importance. On top of that, George Eliot was the pen name of the incredibly influential Mary Ann Evans, who published under a male pen name to escape stereotypes and scandals surrounding female writers at the time. She was a huge example of women in history fighting for creative freedom and to have a creative outlet. to be heard, much like Emily. For Emily to show a kinship with her writing, to have the likeness reflected in her poetry work, even theoretically, is huge and very worthwhile to hold evidence of in one's hands. Palate cleansing ice cream beforehand opened the door for good things to happen. And so the story just goes to show you that if you stop to enjoy the sweeter things in life, sweeter things will happen. Synchronicities are just beyond the bend. Synchronicity.
Hey, Tommy. Can you just say exemplary alone for me?
Exemplary.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's just the...
Let me try it again.
It's okay.
And it's
On top
right
of
as Jay
that-
started.
On top of that, George Eliot will just move on.
Let me do it one more time.